Hello, and welcome back to the Living a Joyful Life Summit. My name's Alexis Moore, and I'm here with Dan Harris. Hi, Dan.
Hi.
Hello. So excited to be here with you. I'm going to read a little bit about you before we jump in here, okay? So, Dan Harris is an author, podcaster, and entrepreneur who worked as an ABC news anchor and correspondent for 21 years, hosting shows such as Nightline and the weekend editions of Good Morning America. He is author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, 10% Happier, a memoir that chronicles his journey from a skeptical news anchor to a proponent of meditation. He is also the co-founder of the 10% Happier meditation app and the host of the 10% Happier podcast. So welcome, Dan. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here with you.
Thank you. So just to get us started, Dan, how do you define joy?
Oof, I don't know. That's a good question. How do I define joy? I kind of think of, the word happiness is a little, I was thinking about this recently. The word happiness is a little controversial because some people say it's not actually what we should be shooting for. It's too fleeting. And I think it's really about definitions. And so I think of happiness as like the catch-all for all of the good stuff we want. And I would put under that joy. I would put under that love, and then under love, connection, compassion, laddering back up to happiness. I would put calm under there. I would put contentedness, gratitude, generosity. Maybe generosity would go under love, which is kind of a bucket I would put under there. Anyway, I'm going down a big rabbit hole here, all as a way to put off answering that question you actually asked me, which is joy. I think of joy as one aspect of happiness, probably not, in my experience, as reliable as contentedness and gratitude and things like that. I think we can tune up our capacity for joy for sure. And you can live a joyful life, one that includes as much joy as possible. But suffering is real and bad luck is real. And so I don't think you should beat yourself up if you're not experiencing joy all the time. One last thing to say. I'm pretty sure that smarter people than me have been appearing in this series and making the case that I would agree with, that you can experience joy even in the midst of circumstances that may compute as frustrating or sad. And that I think is true. So I would say joy is really important and is a skill that you can develop. And don't beat yourself up if you have days that just suck.
Yeah. Yes. The part about beating yourself up if you're not experiencing joy is one that I am familiar with. I've definitely had that experience in the past. It's like, oh man, I should be joyful right now, or I'm not experiencing joy. And that means that I'm not having the experience I should have, or something.
Well, I don't know much about you. Tell me a little bit about yourself, because I can imagine that if you're, a full time in this world of Buddhism, meditation, happiness, or whatever, that joy could be a concept you could use to punish yourself or measure yourself in a negative way against other people. They seem joyful, but why am I the schmuck who's in a bad mood or whatever? That's kind of an excuse for me to hear a little bit more about you, and I'm wondering whether that's maybe part of the pathology.
Mm, mm. How I'll answer that is saying, yeah, I have about 2 years of experience now of like exploring with meditation and practicing meditation. And like earlier on in my meditation journey, when it was, kind of new, just exploring like guided meditations on YouTube, stuff like that. Then I would meditate in the morning and say like, okay, well, this means I should have a good day now because I meditated. And then later on, I would get anxious because I have anxiety and be like, well, okay, well, this isn't supposed to happen. I'm supposed to have a good day. where I was calm and that meant that I was going to be productive. And now this anxiety is getting in the way of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's very common and very natural and human is you start doing this thing that's hard to do, by the way. It's hard to create any habit. So we I think justifiably feel some degree of self-congratulation about the fact that we're doing this thing at all, and then we notice that all many of the difficult aspects of our personality or other people's personalities are still there, and then we use this supposedly good thing as a way to kick our own ass, and that's why I kind of I wanted to emphasize that I think joy is amazing, and as far as I understand Buddhism, I mean, the Buddha talked about it as a key component of the path. And so I'm pro joy. And I just want to recognize that life is often very frustrating and difficult for people. And yes, I think it's possible to experience joy even in really hard moments. And that's kind of like advanced level stuff. In my experience, it's like, I think we should give ourselves permission to feel anxiety, to feel all of the other difficult things as well.
Totally, totally. And that's really, I experienced a shift when I was like, oh, I can give myself permission to actually experience anxiety like that. That's okay. That was a shift. So, in your experience, what does living a joyful life look like to you?
Yeah, I was thinking back to the definition of joy, and I'm probably going to screw this up, but I have a very good friend whose name is Sebene Selassie. She's a meditation teacher, and she used to have, and maybe still does, have as the auto sign off on her email, or the sort of the little quote at the bottom of her email. Mostly I text with her, so I haven't seen her emails recently. But she used to have this quote, and I'm gonna reproduce the person's name. She's quite famous, and it's embarrassing to me that I'm a little uncertain about her name, but I think it's Charlotte Joko Beth or something in that, something close to that. With my apologies to Seb and to the person who said this quote, and I think it is something along the lines of joy is whatever's happening right now minus your opinion of it, and that I think in my understanding, and I'm not that much further along than you are. You said you've been meditating for 2 years. I've been meditating for 12, 13, something like that. So it's not that long. I'm not a meditation master. And I know that you're going to speak to people who have much more solid credentials than I do as part of this series. But in my understanding of how joy can show up in all aspects of life is that you can learn to be mindful of whatever's happening, and there is a certain amount of joy in for me at least in being able to experience emotions that would have derailed me previously and now allow them to come and go, and to see that on the other side of anger, desire, whatever it is a real like freedom, and so if I can just let this emotion come and go, there's some joy in learning that I, along with everybody else who's currently drawing breath on the planet, has this capacity.
Wow. Yeah. You mentioned like joy in learning that, wow, an emotion that used to derail me now is something that can just come up and then pass. And yeah, anyway, there's something that's standing out to me about like the joy coming from just learning that.
The joy coming from not only learning it but doing it. I think
Okay.
one of my areas of focus is really getting is attempting to sort of gently get people interested in meditation, and also encouraging them that even they can do it. And it does take some faith. I know that's a bit of a loaded word, but it takes a little bit of faith or trust or confidence, because meditation the benefits, in my experience, don't often kick in right away. You don't know if it's working. If you go to the gym, you will pant or sweat if you're doing it correctly. You'll feel sore. You'll feel miserable. Well, you'll get some pretty immediate feedback. With meditation, it takes a couple of weeks often. And for me, and I've heard this from people I know who've gotten into meditation. Maybe this will resonate with you. Is one of the moments where you start to feel some real confidence is the first time you feel an urge, like to eat a sleeve of Oreos or to say something that's going to ruin the next 48 hours of your marriage. And you, instead of biting the hook and acting on it reflexively, habitually, automatically, you watch it come and go. That actually is a hugely, can be a hugely faith inspiring experience. And there's a lot of joy in that. Like, wow, look at this thing that I didn't know I could do previously. Look at the freedom that's available to me that I didn't know was available. That's one aspect, I think, of a joyful life.
Look at the freedom that's available to me that wasn't previously available. An experience came to mind while you were describing that I had, which was, yeah, early on in my journey, I was driving to work and I was at a red light and I was late. I was late and I hit the red light, which is so frustrating. Why is this light red? I'm late. Um, and I was so used to being in that moment, just like clenching my steering wheel and like my whole body is tense. And I'm like, ah, you know, so angry. And I just had this realization. I was like, wait, I'm going to get there at the same time either way. And I can either in this moment, like, just be calm and like listen to the music that's on my radio right now, or listen to a nice podcast and like hear it, or I can be angry and feel really negatively in this moment. And it's literally not going to change anything except that maybe I'll get to work. And it was great because I was like teaching stretching classes, which is like relaxing. So I can come to this experience where I'm supposed to help people relax super tense, or I can just arrive, be like, yeah, all right, here I am. I got here, and be in a better mood.
I, a bingo. I mean, gold star as far as I'm concerned. That's exactly right. And that's a thing you can do anytime. Now, I want to be clear. I this up all the time. Like I forget to do it. I think, and this is not an original observation at all. But the biggest challenge on this path, whatever you want to call it, spiritual development, personal growth, whatever, the biggest challenge is forgetting. Because you can listen to a series like this, you can listen to a great podcast, read a good book, go to a retreat, and hear this incredibly inspiring and practical stuff, and then you forget to do it because we're programmed for denial. The culture pulls us away from the things that are good for us often, with its emphasis on consumption and comparison and distraction. And so it's easy to forget to do the thing that we are now talking about. And that's also normal. I want to give people permission to forget. I think the goal and the reason why I, often talk about 10% is to get just a little bit better all the time. Yeah, there's joy in even in that marginal improvement.
Yeah, and I love how you're talking about this in such like an approachable way. I think it makes practicing this feel very approachable. And I'm curious if you can share a little bit about your journey that led to you writing 10% Happier. And yeah, that kind of precipitated like a major life change for yourself.
Yeah, well, I don't recommend my path because it involved, cocaine and a panic attack on national television. So it's not like what I would, prescribe to others. But yeah, I as you mentioned earlier, I used to be a anchorman on ABC News for like a million years, and I was also a correspondent, so I would travel around covering big stories. And in my early 30s, in the early aughts, I spent a lot of time in war zones after 9/11. And I came home in the middle of that period and got depressed. But I didn't actually know I was depressed. So I did something very dumb, which is I started self-medicating with cocaine and other drugs. And that led to me having a panic attack on Good Morning America. If you Google panic attack on television, I believe it is the first result, which is great for me and everybody in my mom. So that happened. I was not high on the air, but afterwards I went to a doctor to figure out what happened, and he was like, "Do you do drugs?" And I said yes, and he was like, "Bingo." And so that that precipitated some significant changes. I stopped doing drugs, and I started seeing this doctor once or twice a week. And through therapy, I ultimately came across meditation. And this was in 2008 or nine. And I sometimes joke that this is the first time in my life I've ever been ahead of a trend, because at that point, meditation was not cool. It had been cool in the 60s, and it was definitely cool in the Buddha's time 2,600 years ago, but it was not cool at that point. And so I was um, very skeptical. Because I was raised by hippies, and I associated meditation with, patchouli smelling, crystal collecting uh, folks, which is not entirely untrue. Um, but I luckily, I think because of like my journalistic background, I was able to fish around and find that there had been an explosion in scientific research into meditation, and had demonstrated that the practice has many benefits. And now many of us know about this research, but at that point it wasn't very well publicized. So I realized, one, that the meditation might be good for me, because I like you have anxiety and also bouts of depression at various points in my life. And the second thing I realized was this is a good story, and not hadn't really been widely reported. Um, there were, Buddhist communities and other small communities that were into meditation, but at that point, it wasn't mainstream in any way. So, and I was working in mainstream media, so I thought, okay, well, let me see if I can. I had long kind of wanted to write a book. I don't know why. I just had this desire to write a book. Maybe it's like the Anchorman's desire for some degree of impermanence and like a relentlessly, some degree of permanence in like a relentlessly ephemeral world of broadcast. And so I wrote a book about it called 10% Happier. And I kind of thought it would be mildly embarrassing and then go away. And then it actually ended up being way more successful than I had fantasized about. And it turned into a podcast and more books and an app and things like that. And so then I actually quit my job as a newsman 2 years ago, and I do this stuff all the time.
You know, by the way, thank you for doing this stuff all the time. It was very
Thanks.
cool. And you mentioned the skepticism that you had, and then you also had mentioned earlier about needing to have a little bit of like faith or trust or confidence in the practice of meditation to continue. Yeah, so I'm curious about, yeah, like what what would you maybe tell someone who's also kind of skeptical to help them maybe build a little bit of that trust in
Hmm.
practicing? And was that a challenge for you in your own experience to kind of have a little, skepticism at first?
Yeah. Yes, it was. I think for me, what really helped was the science. It's kind of the franca of our culture, and my parents are scientists. My wife is a scientist, and so like it all that just that relaxed my nervous system when I saw there's evidence. I don't think once you start doing the thing, it doesn't really matter what the evidence says, but it's nice. I think as an evangelical tool, I find the science very helpful, because
Mm-hmm.
generally in our culture, people are interested in doing the thing that science says you should do. So yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And yeah, absolutely, the skepticism was, yeah, at times it still trips me up, because I think, one, there's skepticism, and then there's closed mindedness, and I think skepticism is generally helpful, and then sometimes I'm dismissive or closed minded, and that is not so helpful.
Yeah, I actually really appreciate that, like kind of discerning those two things, like closed-mindedness versus having skepticism. Um, yeah, so for you, you had kind of the scientific research to give you some like relaxation that okay, this could be a good thing or maybe a helpful thing to practice. And then how long do you feel like it took you to start experiencing some of the benefits of the practice? Like what did like getting started with that look like for you? And how did you keep going until you started to experience some of the benefit yourself?
Uh, I think it really is about the science and also suffering. So like um, once I saw the science, I really believed that it was going to be beneficial to me. So I was willing to keep going with it. I think curiosity was a big thing. I'm as a journalist for many, many years. I, I'm actually not much of a news junkie. I didn't stay in that job because I always need to know what's going on. Often I don't even care. Um, but what I really liked about my job was the ability to find strange worlds that I had never been in and to dive into that and learn more about it and experience it. And that that's what Buddhism still feels like to me. It's so interesting. And so a combination of the science plus curiosity around what would the practice do for me and what is this whole world about, and then suffering, just having been so anxious for
Yeah.
so long, um, that all kept me going. And then how did I know it was working for me? Well, the first thing I like this story. The first thing, the first data point was that I was at a cocktail party and I overheard my wife saying to one of our friends, "Yeah, Dan started meditating and he's less of a head." And I thought, all right, well, I mean, I'm glad that's true. That's her experience, and and I think that's true for many of us that we might not be the first
Mhm.
to to notice the change, and often we're not the most keen observers of our own uh, happiness levels. In some ways, it's like the people who really live with you might see things before you do, or they may see them more clearly. And then it's like we discussed before. I think I started to have these moments where I would have lost my temper,
Mhm.
and I wasn't losing my temper as much. And I mean, I want to be clear. I still lose my temper occasionally, but it's way less frequent than it's ever been. And so I don't think perfection's on offer here, but you start to get on this gradual path of improvement, and it's kind of like the path goes like this,
Right.
because you catch me on the wrong day, and you know, uh, I will maybe do or say something I'm not proud of, but I think generally over time it goes in a positive direction.
Yeah. And can you maybe share like some of the challenges that you did have when you first got started with meditation?
I'm glad you asked that because when you asked what do I do to encourage skeptics, I don't actually think in the culture right now that there's a massive amount of skepticism about meditation. When I first started, my book came out almost 10 years ago, and when I first started, going on TV shows to talk about it or traveling around and speaking to audiences about it, there was a there was a lot of skepticism about meditation. It feels to me like much more acceptable in the culture now.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think the skepticism, and sure, yes, there are people who are skeptical, but I mean,
Mhm.
it's not embarrassing to admit that you meditate
Right.
in mixed company now. Whereas in 2014, when my book came out, when I was doing my press tour for the book, I wouldn't even let people take pictures of me meditating because I was too sheepish about it.
Mhm.
Now I was fine. What I think people are skeptical about instead is whether they can meditate.
Right.
I think a lot of people feel, and maybe you've experienced this, that um, yeah, I get meditation is good for me, but you don't understand my mind. My mind is too busy to meditate, and so I spend a lot of time reassuring people about that.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's like you don't understand what's going on in my mind that this is not going to be able to help with. Like observing this isn't enough. It has to be different or something. Yeah. Like when I first started not first started, maybe like a year into meditating, which is when I started working with a teacher. Then I came to this like 2 day retreat, and and I was late again. Gosh, yeah. And so I get there, and it's like, okay, we're going right. Like I missed the intro, and we're going right into the first sit. And she's like, okay, yeah, we're gonna sit for 45 minutes. And I was like, what? 45 minutes? What are you talking about? And I was like, okay, well, surely, there'll be some guidance or something. Yeah, there's a little bit, but it's mostly silent. And I was like, what? It felt so insurmountable to me. And the biggest thing that would come up for me is like I would have a lot of restlessness, which is no
Mm,
surprise because, like I said, I was always late, still struggle with being late, etc. Point is, I had so much restlessness within me. And what I mean by restlessness, to get a little more specific, it's like I want to jump up. I like want to open my eyes. I want to just jump out of my seat. And that felt like, and I'd be so focused the whole time. And it's still a challenge, but I'd be so focused the whole time. When is it going to be over? When is it going to be over? When is it going to be? When is it going to be over? And like that would create, yeah, just a lot of discomfort for me. And by continuing, I was able to find like, okay, yeah, actually, this does pass. Like, this is something that can be observed, and then it'll pass, and then actually,
mhm.
like, I'll be fine in this moment. I was kind of wondering, like, for you, like, how did you get through those first
Yeah.
experiences yourself? Or yeah.
Well, I just want to validate what you're saying that restlessness, I mean, all the way back to the Buddha, to the time of the Buddha, when they list common hindrances to meditation, common problems or obstacles that people encounter when they're meditating. Restlessness is right there on the list. And I experience to this day a ton of restlessness. It's not so much like I don't want to be here, or I definitely experienced that early on. Now it's less, what am I doing? I don't want to be here. When's this going to end? It's more like occasionally I just get these, more than occasionally, frequently, I get these big rolling waves of I want to wriggle out of the chair. I need to move my body. It's so uncomfortable. Do you ever see that movie, The Princess Bride? And there's this torture device they hook people up to, and it like makes them uh, just incredibly uncomfortable. That is what I feel like sometimes on the cushion. And there are a couple of ways to deal with it, or at least that have been helpful for me. One is just to be mindful of it. But sometimes, actually, for me, it's just so powerful that I can only sit with it for 5, 10 minutes. You can stand up while you're meditating. For me, I found that really helpful. I also find it very helpful to switch to walking meditation. Um, so those just I'm just riffing in response to what you said, and which I really appreciate. In terms of how did I get through um, the hurdles early on. Often, well, I will say I'm a bit of a mutant because habit formation is really, really hard, but not really for me. I am very good at establishing habits. Often there are some habits that I still struggle with, but generally speaking, I am extremely disciplined. And when I think it's a double-edged sword, and I've received this feedback that one of my greatest strengths is that I'm stubborn, and one of my greatest weaknesses is that I'm stubborn. And when I decided I'm going to meditate, I started reading books about it, and I remember some of the early books I read. Dr. Mark Epstein. Well, my wife gave me that book. That's really what turned me on to Buddhism. And then I read a book by Jon Kabat-Zinn, Wherever You Go, There You Are. And I was reading that book poolside at a rental house with some friends. And I got up from the pool, went to the bedroom I was sharing with my, I think then fiance, or maybe we were married by this point. And I didn't, because I didn't want anybody to see me. And I set an alarm on my BlackBerry. I think I did. We didn't have iPhones at that point. And I did 5 minutes. And I basically just told myself, I'm going to do this every day. And I'm the kind of annoying person who can make that declaration and stick to it. Most people are not. And so I want to recognize that if you want to talk about it, there are some tricks for habit formation that are science based, that are very useful. One of them actually is, and one of the things I did right here was I said I'm only going to do 5 minutes a day. And the data show that the research shows that if you set the bar low in that way, even if you set it at 1 minute, most days, 1 minute daily ish, that has actually been shown to be a great pathway to establishing an abiding habit.
Mm, yes, and that reminds me of why I brought that up in the first place, which was about the skepticism. And it's like with that experience, like, there's so much restlessness, then that the skepticism would be, I haven't experienced the part yet where I'm able to move through that, or it's going to be different.
Mm.
So I don't have maybe the trust yet that that this is for me. I'm like, oh well, I mean, if I'm feeling like this, this is, maybe too much, or something like that. But yeah, I think it's helpful what you're saying to just normalize that this is what the experience is like. Um, and that's normal. And yeah, when you keep going, it does change, but it's normal to like not necessarily have a whole lot of that confidence at first that it can,
Yes. Yes.
that it can't.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's going to be bumpy
Yes.
for most of us at the beginning, and that's okay. I mean, how many habits have you established where it's not bumpy? I mean, do you ever learn an instrument or any sort of new skill? I don't know why people are so surprised that learning meditation can be difficult. Whereas if I said to you, I'm going to teach you how to play the flute,
Right.
you wouldn't be surprised if it took a minute before you could, play along to a Jethro Tull song or whatever it is. So this is a skill, and it's an art, and it's a science of the mind. It is a really vast area of human endeavor. Training the mind is, and it takes a minute, And if you're, if you are a Buddhist of deeper faith than I am, you might even say it takes several lifetimes.
Right.
Like if you look at the stories about the Buddha,
Right.
they talk about how many lifetimes he had before he became the Buddha, and I don't see that as discouraging. I see that as encouraging. That like this is a long road, and so I don't need to tell myself a whole story about what an irretrievably horrible person I am because I'm still making mistakes along the way. I do want to jump in on something you said before about the skepticism. Is this for me? Can I do this? I think that kind of thought track, and again, I'm not a Buddhist scholar, but my understanding of Buddhism would suggest that kind of thought track jumps the line between skepticism and doubt. And now, so doubt is doubt in the Buddhist, in Buddhism is, and again, with my apologies to actual Buddhist teachers out there who may know more about this than I do, but doubt is always used in the pejorative. So in our culture, we think of doubt as kind of having a healthy variety, which I would call skepticism. But the doubt in Buddhism that is basically always viewed as a hindrance to meditation is this kind of quicksand of, I can't do this, the teacher's an idiot, that absolutely stymies progress. So I think it's useful to have skepticism, but when you get into doubt, and just play with this in your own mind, I think when you get into doubt, that's where the problems are. And I think, in my experience, the way to deal with that is mindfulness. And anybody who's meditated will be familiar with this concept of mental noting. So often in meditation, we're taught just to focus on, or beginning meditation, you focus on your breath, feel it come in, go out. Every time you get distracted, you start again and again and again. Those are the basic instructions. As you get a little bit more solid and grounded in those basic instructions, one added instruction that often gets introduced is mental noting. So you are focusing on your breath, and then you get distracted and you start planning a homicide or thinking about all the terrible things you can say to your boss about all of her or their or his terrible behavior or whatever, and you might just note, okay,
Ooh,
anger, and then you go back to the breath, and that little gentle mental note can slice, it can cut through your um, your clinging to, your over identification with, your being lost in the emotion or the thought pattern. And same with doubt. If I have found it very helpful if I'm on a meditation retreat or if I'm even sitting at my house and I lapse into, I can't do this, or somebody else is better than me, or I'm a fraud or whatever. Psh, doubt.
so good. That's so good. And I really appreciate you catching that and that discernment of doubt versus skepticism. So could you define maybe for us, like what would be skepticism in the way that we're talking about it? Because the skepticism sounds healthy and useful, and the doubt, like you said, it was kind of like this downward spiral, and that's not very helpful. So yeah, could you kind of define the skepticism?
Yeah, I mean, I'm making this up, but I think
Sure.
if you're new to meditation, and you might be thinking, yeah, well, I think it's fair to think, as I did at the beginning, well, is this hippie nonsense? Is this like in the same category as hacky sack or aura readings or whatever? Okay, I think those are fair questions. But
Sure.
then once you've been presented with a fair amount of research, I think perseverating over that, you know, for way too long is that's
Mhm.
that's where you get into doubt.
Wow.
I think it's if you're vetting a teacher that you might want to study with. Um, do I want to download this person's app, or do I want to take a Zoom course with this other person? I think it's useful to think, oh, well, what was that guy's training again? And do I like the way they talk about X or Y? Do I relate to this person? I think that kind of skepticism, rigorousness, and rigor in decision making, that all makes sense. But after a while, make a choice and commit for a minute. And so I think you have to play with it in your own mind. When is it useful, and when is it quicksand?
Wow. That is so, yeah, that is really helpful. Yeah, I didn't notice that. Like when it goes into um, a place where it's like, actually, this would just block me from finding out more and discovering, uh, what could come from continuing to explore. Um, yeah, so can you elaborate also what on what 10% happier means in practical terms? Right.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of half a joke. I uh, like I said before, I started to get interested in meditation before it was socially acceptable, and I had this idea that maybe I could talk about it in a way that would be different than the way other folks were talking about it, and but I didn't know exactly how to do that yet. And I went on my first meditation retreat in the summer of 2010, and I came home from that, and one of my colleagues, a very close colleague of mine, Chris Sebastian, she was. I remember exactly where we were and what the conversation was. She basically said something to the effect of like, why did you do this? You used to be normal and maybe cool. And like, why, what is the matter with you? Why are you going on a meditation retreat? And I said something like, it makes me like 10% happier. And I remember the look on her face changed from scorn to mild interest. And I thought, okay, that's my shtick. 10% happier. We don't have to overpromise here. Um, this is not a miracle cure. This is a skill
Mm-hmm.
that you can learn and will have impact over time. And speaking of time, now that I'm stuck with math jokes for the rest of my life, um, I do think that the interest compounds annually. Like any good investment, I'm way more than 10% happier now than I was in 2010 having that conversation with Chris Sebastian. You just get better and better over time. And again, that doesn't mean it's like an unbroken path toward nirvana. It's kind of, up and down, and you're going to make mistakes, and life is going to throw hard things at you, and all of that is still true. But it's incredibly good news that the mind is trainable, that happiness, compassion, calm, generosity, gratitude, that these are not factory settings. These are skills that you can train. That's just incredibly good news. And so that's my job on the planet, is to just point that out in as many ways as possible now.
And so how can you perceive that 10% increase in happiness? Like what we kind of been talking about it, but like what can we look for as we're doing this practice and the doubt comes up? Am I doing it right? These kind of things. So how can we actually perceive, like, wait a second, no, I am getting benefit. This is a good thing for me to keep doing. I am getting benefit.
There's a great teacher named Matthew Brensilver. Do you know him?
Mm-mm.
Okay. He's a great meditation teacher, and he's been on my podcast a couple times. I've never met him in person, but I'm a big admirer. He's very smart. And he has said, your progress is none of your business. And I really like that, because we can get obsessed, and I have been guilty of this many, many times. Get obsessed with, am I doing it right? Am I making progress? And often I've gotten the note from teachers like, your progress is none of your business. Or one of the other things that my teacher, Joseph Goldstein, has said to me many times, and he says this to many people, is surrender. Not give up, but like, just do the practice. Yeah. Sit and walk. Stop obsessing over your progress. Stop playing what he calls the practice assessment tapes. So that's all very helpful. And of course, you want, as I think a healthy kind of modern skeptical person is going to want to know. We live in a society where we do things and expect a result over time. And I think you are going to want like some reassurance that there is some benefit. And so I think there are a couple of ways to think about this. One is, are you losing your temper? Are you lapsing into self-laceration and self-hatred? Are you demonstrating more patience? Are these changes happening in marginal but meaningful ways in your life? That I think is a great question to ask, and to ask it holistically, not like, was I a today? Because on any given day, maybe you were.
Right.
And then the other thing is to just ask the people in your life. Feedback from my wife has been very helpful. Now, I don't always like the feedback, but it's very helpful. So I think that's another thing to think about. In terms of how do you gauge the 10% of it all, it's again, it is a bit of a joke. It's unscientific. But it does go back to what I was saying before. Like, can you generate some confidence that the things you've struggled with are getting just a little bit easier, and that the things that you like about yourself or like in life generally are getting a little better? Does your food taste a little better because you've learned how to pay attention? Does nature feel even more satisfying because you are taking it in instead of rushing into the next thing? All of the, does the laughter of your children or grandchildren or the kids of your friends or whatever, does that, make you more, to use the word of the day, joyous than it might have 6 weeks ago? I think these are just questions you can gently ask yourself. And I don't know anybody who's meditated for any period of time, like longer than a month, who can't answer those questions in a positive way, that there is improvement. I think that first month is the trickiest part, because for many of us, it's not yet clear. And often, actually, you feel more anxious
Right.
or more depressed because you're more aware, you're more mindful. And so that can seem like it's backfiring, but it's actually working. Um,
Mm,
so this is a tricky business.
mm. Yeah, and I love there's I don't know where I heard this quote, but it says like pain is not a sign of lack of progress.
Definitely not.
Yeah,
No,
I find that
that
so
and
helpful.
the other expression that people often throw around, I think is pretty good, is that um, pain is. I'm going to mangle this, but it's something like pain is guaranteed. The
Hmm.
suffering is optional.
Right.
Like you don't have to. You don't have to. It's still when your alarm clock goes off, it might be an uncomfortable moment, but you don't have to make it as bad as you've been making it. And that's really helpful. Really helpful.
And you gave the example of like, you don't just because you're this way on one day, doesn't mean that it's not working. I think that it's actually that can be a helpful metric still because maybe you were previously on all 5 days and now it's like,
Yes.
wow, it's just one day
Yes.
that I
Yes.
was being when I reflect, I'm like, yeah, that wasn't my best today, but it used to be every day. And I
Hmm.
used to not care, and at least now I care, you know. Um, and yeah, and kind of the topic, yeah, there's some joy in that. It's like, wow, I can really change. Like to me, that's really hopeful. It's like, wow, I can really change in a way that's I find more freedom.
Hmm.
Yeah, that
You said it
feels
well.
very joyful. Yeah, and so let's see. And this is also what you were describing as far as like how to look for the 10% changes or then it's so subtle. The things that you're describing are so subtle. And to me, that feels so different than, what I guess life as a default can typically feel like. And, you've experienced like a high stakes career that's like high stress and things like that. And so, yeah, these things feel so subtle compared to maybe how life feels as like a default setting. Um, yeah, I'm curious, like, what are some ways that for you would suggest incorporating mindfulness into like a busy work life?
I think this is a big problem for people. The how do I find time for it? I mean, I think
Mm,
now, um, as I said before, I encounter a lot less skepticism about the value of the practice and more skepticism about, as we discussed, whether a lot of people think, well, I can't do this. I'm uniquely distractible or dysfunctional or whatever. I call that the fallacy of uniqueness. The truth is that we all have racing minds, um, and some of us are have more emotional issues than others based on how we were raised or our DNA and all of that stuff. So that's all true. But from what I can tell, anybody can meditate, even you. And if you've got trauma or significant mental health problems, it probably makes sense to do it with a mental health professional or under their tutelage or guidance. But from what I can tell, pretty much anybody can meditate. Um, but the other area of skepticism I encounter is I don't have time for this. And I have a lot of sympathy for that because we are busy and the sensation of time starvation is really real. I think if you were to take a careful um, inventory of how you're spending your time, you might be able to carve 5 minutes out from your allotted Instagram scrolling time. And nothing against social media. I'm just saying there are lots of little sinkholes of time in our life that we overlook, and you can carve a few minutes out of those, and really just a few minutes, especially at the beginning, that's enough. The other thing is that you can take activities that you're already doing and turn those into mini meditations, washing the dishes, brushing your teeth, walking. I mean, literally walking anywhere.
mm,
Um, and it's it's just about tuning into the physical sensations of the activity, the tightness in your hamstrings, the air on your face as you're walking, the water on your hands as you're cleaning the dishes, the motion of your hand as you're brushing your teeth. You tune into those sensations. Every time you get distracted, you start again and again and again. Bingo, that you're meditating. So there are lots of ways to get this into a busy life. The two that we've just discussed, just to sum up here: one, start small, pick a few minutes; two, co-opt daily activities and turn them into meditations. And the third thing I'll just throw over the transom as because it just came to mind is that often, speaking of brushing your teeth, if you have a well-established habit, you can, and this is actually a scientific term, piggyback the new habit that you want to establish onto it. So piggybacking, this is what behavior change researchers call it, is a proven technique. So you say, okay, every day I brush my teeth at 7 in the morning and at 10 at night. Can I do 2 minutes of meditation right after that? Or every day I exercise. Can I do minutes of meditation right before or after that? So this is a hard thing to do, to find the time and then to establish the habit. I think actually knowing that it's hard can be liberating because you won't tell yourself the story that you're uniquely dysfunctional. And then use science-based behavioral hacks to get the habit into your molecules in a way that you move from extrinsic motivation, meaning I'm telling you to do something, to intrinsic motivation, which is you're doing it because you know life sucks even more if you don't do it.
Right, right. And, a good example of what you're talking about is before we had this talk today, earlier this morning, I was eating breakfast and I was like, I want to look at the questions that I'm going to ask Dan. I'm going to look at those. And I was eating and I was like, wait, like, I know. So it's like, just like kind of shoving the food in my mouth. And I was looking at the questions and it's like, yeah, the food is good, but I'm kind of just like downing it. And I was like, actually, like eating the food is an activity. So I can like do that later and I can just eat right now. And this is like a experience for me to be present for, which is, yeah, something that reminded me of what you're describing.
Yes.
And, again, like how subtle that is. So, yeah, for you, like when you were in that period before you started exploring with meditation and you were kind of in that high stress state, then like at that time in your life, how did you define joy then, or what did you think joy that was then compared to like what you're now describing?
I think that version of me thought of joy, happiness as, I think I had it conflated with excitement. So professional achievements, right, purchases, eating a donut, whatever, the little dopamine hits.
Yes.
I think that's what I wouldn't have had a definition for joy, but I probably that's where I would have bucketed it. And now I think of joy as much really like I'm mangling her name, Charlotte Joko Beck, I think is her name. It's all of those things, and can you be cool with whatever's happening right now? And it's much subtler, and so that kind of joy can arise even in annoying moments.
Right. Yeah, and what you're describing, like my kind of description of that, like purchases and the career achievements, like these high octane experiences are where the joy is going to come from. And now what we're describing, and what I hear you describing, is like, yeah, something that's so much more subtle than that. So it's like kind of retraining, like what to even maybe look for, or I don't want to say expect, but
yeah, it's like broadening the palette. Like
broadening the palette.
Yeah, I still like professional achievements and donuts. They're even better if you're awake for them instead of thinking about what's coming next,
Mm,
and lots of things that you might have um, hitherto ignored or overlooked or rushed through can also be sources of joy. So life just becomes, from a joy perspective, much more of a target-rich environment, I think.
wow. Much more of a target rich environment. I like that, broadening the palette too. Yeah. Yeah. So, in our last couple of minutes here, yeah, what advice would you offer someone who's contemplating a major life change? And what factors should they consider in their quest for a more fulfilling and happier life?
Things are coming to mind. One is just to reiterate that um, change is possible. But it
Mhm.
really is possible. Obviously we have to obey the laws of physics. I, as a 5'8", 52-year-old, am not going to join the NBA. However, I can be way more fit, way happier, way more connected, way more successful, whatever it is I want. My ability to achieve it and to change in and evolve in that direction is more than the story I may be telling myself. Um, and I think, I just love pointing out that we all have goals. I think things we want out of life, and they may be quite concrete. Or I want to get this job, or I want to buy this house, or I want to have this relationship. But actually, what we want, if the at the fundamental level, is states of mind. We want the states of mind that accompany these achievements, and all the states of mind are trainable. Often in our culture, we're being trained toward consumption, isolation, anger, judgment, comparison. But what Buddhism has on offer is a many millennia long, tried and tested set of practices for developing positive emotions, and that is just doable, and that's not a controversial assertion, I don't think.
Mhm.
Um, and then the second thing to say is that I was interviewing on my show recently a guy named David Ross-Marin, who runs the Center for Anxiety at Harvard. I was joking that the Center for Anxiety sounds like a super fun place. But we have epidemic levels of anxiety. I have a 9-year-old kid, and I see, especially among young people, just unbelievable levels of anxiety. It's horrifying, really. And David's Dr. Ross Marin's assertion, and there are others who believe this too, and it rings true to me, is that one of the major contributors is a fear of discomfort.
Mhm.
And that's not to say that younger people are um, malfunctioning. It's the world we've created for them, where uh, technology has reduced friction so low, and where parents hover so much that when many young people, and I think this is true for people my age and older too, when many of us experience discomfort, we tell ourselves a story that there's something wrong, something's going wrong. But discomfort is part of life, and it's definitely part of life if you're contemplating a major change.
Mhm.
Which brings us back to your question. If you're gonna try to do anything big, from a parenting standpoint, from a volunteer standpoint, from a service standpoint, from a professional standpoint, it's going to be uncomfortable. Nothing's going wrong if it's uncomfortable. You're doing it right. And so I think the challenge of many lifetimes, many of our lives, the big challenge is going to be, can you be okay with being uncomfortable? Because if you've got big goals, uh, you're going to be uncomfortable. And discomfort is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. Usually or often it's a sign that you're doing something right. You're pushing yourself.
And how can mindfulness help with kind of moving through that discomfort and
Yes.
building emotional resilience.
Because you can see, as this seemingly stupid activity of just watching your breath or feeling your breath, actually more accurately, feeling your breath and then getting distracted and starting again and again and again. It has many benefits, but one of the biggies is that you develop a kind of self-awareness
Mhm.
that we call mindfulness. Um, how does this happen? Because you sit and you feel your breath, and then you get carried away by random thoughts over and over. And maybe one of those thoughts is, I can never do this because I'm uniquely distractible. And then you wake up from distraction and you go back to the breath over and over and over again. And a lot of people feel that they're doing it wrong in those moments of waking up from distraction. But actually that is proof that you're doing it right. You want to see how wild the mind is so that you're not owned by all of your ancient storylines and neuroses and all of the terrible ideas that the culture or your parents have imbued into you. And so in those moments of discomfort, if you've got some self-awareness, if you've got some mindfulness on board through this practice, you can see, oh yeah, I'm telling myself a story that my being nervous about going in to give a big presentation to the boss is somehow a sign that I'm broken. But that's just a story. And can I just feel the physical sensations of this nervousness, and notice that like everything else in the world, they're changing. They come and go and come and go. And can I be okay with it? To me, that's how mindfulness can help you power through um, the discomfort that is non-negotiable if you want to try to do anything big.
And I think that's just a mic drop moment. You know, your mic is set up on a thing where we can't just drop it, but if we could, we would just drop the mic on that. And my teacher says mindfulness is mental protection. And I
Yes.
just love that. It's like protecting you, like you said, not owned by the neuroses. I'm protected. I have some little protection against these neuroses. Like, oh, it's like a story. Wow. And I appreciate what you're saying, Dan. Thank you so much. I mean, this is incredibly insightful and helpful, and it feels really approachable how you're describing it. Um, and so, yeah, as we move toward the end of our time, then are there any final things you'd like to share that you think would help our audience with living a joyful life?
I think your audience has heard enough out of me, but I just say that it was a pleasure talking to you. Great questions, and yeah, you got a future as an interviewer if you want one.
Huh. I'm going to digest that and receive it as best I can in this moment. Thank you. So, how can people learn about you and your work?
Maybe the easiest thing is I have a podcast. It's called 10% Happier. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. I also wrote a book by that same name. I can't believe the 10th anniversary edition is coming out in March. So there's that. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Do you have any math jokes prepared for the 10th anniversary of 10% Happier?
Uh, no, I don't have any math. I'm really bad at math, so I don't have any good jokes. Mostly these days, I'm stealing my jokes from my son,
Sure.
who is really good at zingers. Mostly directed at his father. Like just the other day, I made a dumb joke, and he said, "Daddy, sometimes you're hard to love." Yeah, that's how it is in my house.
Great. It sounds like a home of joy. Yeah.
It is a home of joy. If you like insult comics, it is a home of joy.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dan, and thanks for just using your life experience to, share with us and pass it along to just really help. Thank you.
Yeah. One last thing to say is that Inside LA is a fantastic organization, and I just recommend it to everybody. And there are so many great insight meditation oriented organizations throughout the country: Spirit Rock, Insight Meditation Society, New York Insight. So I just wherever you live, if you've got one of those in your area, I recommend supporting them in whatever way you can.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Working the first retreat that I mentioned that I went on, where I had that restlessness, was with Insight and was with my teacher Melissa McKay, who's a teacher with them. And I would just add to that that even if you're not in the areas that those centers that you mentioned are located, then there's virtual offerings, there's virtual retreats that
Yes,
you can still
yes,
participate in, and those
yes,
can be very helpful to get some guidance and get some experience of what we're discussing.
yes, yes, absolutely. You don't need to. I mean, it's great if you can access New York Insight or East Bay Meditation Center or any of these sort of this incredible archipelago of awesome meditation centers across the country. But if you're in a place that you don't have access to them, they all offer online teachings, and um, it's just primo stuff.
Absolutely. And in the meantime, you can always set your timer for 5 minutes while you're on vacation with your friends. You can sneak
Yes,
into a
yes,
room and you can set your timer and you can do it that
hmm
way. You can download the 10% Happier app and you can do that. So there's just so many openings that you can walk through.
yes. Well said.
Thank you. All right, Dan, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you.